I'm Elizabeth Gordon. I'm the co-founder of Extraordinary Journeys, a travel company offering custom travel experiences around the world. And we like to work with suppliers who are committed to conservation and local communities. Our talks have two goals. The first is to keep our clients, our friends, our staff connected to the amazing wildlife and the outstanding people we work with. The second has been to raise money for projects that are particularly affected and dependent on tourism to support their conservation goal. So we created a fund where you can donate to our website. And we distribute it to the different partners we work with, but you are also free to donate directly to African bush camps. They have their own foundation today, and Beks will talk to us about it. I'll be sending you information about how to do this after the raised actually about $8,500 since we started these virtual series, and we've been really excited with the support and have the support we've had so far. And also anyone who donates, keep your receipts. If you've donated up to anything you've donated, we'll match up to $150 towards your next trip to Africa, and this is per person for your next trip. So just let us know if you've donated, and when you plan your trip, we'll make sure we put that towards your trip. So today, our special speaker today is Beks, founder of African Bush Camp. African Bush Camp owns 50 luxury camps in Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Zambia. They operate with a strong focus on conservation, environmentally sustainable footprint, and they celebrate the culture of the communities in the areas in which they operate. About 2.5% of their revenue goes to their African Bush Camp Foundation. Beks today will talk about the effects of coronavirus on his staff and communities, as well as his view on how and when tourism will return. And then also, with everything that's been happening in the United States, I think there's just a lot of awareness about racial diversity. And I thought it would be really interesting to broach this, the subject and the lack of diversity in the travel world. I think it's just very, as I was thinking, I live in DC and I think of everything that's been happening around me. It just really dawned on me, every time I go to travel trade shows, there are very few people of color. And I've asked Beks today if we can open up the conversation and get his insight of what it means to be one of the few Black safari camp owners, founders, and CEOs in the industry, as well as a leader in conservation debates and actions. So I hope, this is not what I was going to talk about at first, but I think it's just a very interesting conversation to have and how we can encourage more diversity and leadership in the industry. So to start off, I'd like to start with a video of African Bush Camp and their foundation. I think it's a good way to kind of get our mind, to get us dreaming and to remember the places where we haven't been to in a while, because everyone has been a little stuck at home. So here we go. I'm gonna put it on. I'm gonna share my screen, so hold on 1 second. Is that good?
Yeah, yes.
The world is facing an unprecedented challenge, and although we may be apart, we still stand as one in our efforts, our perseverance. During this trying period, we hope you take time to reflect, to read that book, to dream, and to consider Africa. To our greatest treasure, the wonderful men and women that make up the African Bush Camps team, we want to acknowledge the enormous contribution you're all making. From being champions of education in your communities and in the fight against COVID-19, fulfilling the roles of wildlife guardians during this time of reduced protective eyes. You are the heart and soul of our business. Your tireless work secures a future for all of us. And to our guests, our industry friends and conservation allies, and of course, our local communities. We are in this together. We know better than anyone the importance of tourism to local communities and conservation initiatives. African bush camps who are dedicated to ensuring that Africa will continue to grow more than ever to help us on this journey. The storm will end, and when it does, Africa will be here to welcome you with open arms.
Okay, so Beks, thank you for joining us. So I just wanted to start off a little bit with talking about you and your background. You know, you're an amazing entrepreneur. You have this great collection of upscale safari camp. But I want to know, how did you get there and what your current, you know, I just want to talk about like kind of your journey to where you are today. Just tell us a little bit more about where did you grow up? Where are you from? Let's start with that. I think that's a kind of a good place. You're Zimbabwean. I believe you're from Wengi, from an area close to Wengi, is that right?
That's right. Thanks, Elizabeth. And first of all, thank you for having me tonight on your talk, afternoon for you. And thank you to the audience for joining us, particularly at this time. You can hear me all right?
Yep.
So I was born, I started my journey into this life actually in an area called Lupani, which is a village just outside of Wange National Park in Zimbabwe. I was born in a village called Lupani. And I spent the first 5 to 6 years of my life in the rural setting before we moved into an urban environment in the city of Bulawayo, where we didn't last very long until we actually moved to a small little coal mining town called Wange, which is just outside of Wange National Park. So we more or less, after a little while, went back not too far from where I was born and spent the rest of my education years, schooling years, both primary and high school years. It was after high school, really. In fact, it was during my last 2 years of high school, I started sort of venturing out and getting a real feel of what it was like to have access to wildlife. The sort of school I went to was a boarding school, and it had its own school farm. So we managed to spend as many times, weekends, away, camping, fishing, doing stuff outdoors. And that really intrigued me. Of course, that spoke quite a lot into my upbringing for the first 5 to 6 years of my life in a rural setting, to the extent that I started visiting friends in safari camps in the last 2 years of my high school, which of course resulted in me having opportunity to learn away from these 4 walls that our traditional learning system allows us to do or forces us to do for the most part of our lives. So it was in this outdoor space where I felt I learned quite a lot from nature, from wildlife. And literally, I left high school, did my driver's license, first aid certificate, and I went and started training as a learner guide. And it took me 3 years to get my professional guide license and continued to guide for 10 years, of which 6 years was at a very well-established organization that did safaris in Zimbabwe and Botswana at the time. And of course, I broke out and started doing private guided safaris, where I was very fortunate enough to see various parts of Africa, including Zambia, Namibia, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda. So it was really quite an incredible journey to be able to start in Zimbabwe, see a bit of Botswana, and then expand the horizon. And it was in expanding the horizon that I began to be very much aware of a lot of concerns, both environmentally and also rural areas, but also the way in which our tourism industry was taking shape. But it also became very apparent that my impact as an individual doing private guided safaris was far less than if I went into this with other people. So I felt it was really time 16 years ago to explore ideas as to how I could take others with me for the long journey. And that's where we started our first camp, Somalisa Camp in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, how did you jump from being a guide to being a camp owner? Yeah, how that started. And did you just started with one camp, and was it in Zimbabwe? I see you also have camps in Botswana. So how did you kind of go from just one? I believe it was a pretty simple camp in the beginning. You know, when I first met you, it was about bringing guides. It was a place for guides to be able to bring their clients. It's kind of evolved from there. Do you want to talk about that?
It's evolved a little bit, but you know, as I said to you, I think I was fortunate enough through my journey to have learned quite a lot and had, and really I was exposed to a lot of different scenarios where I got a lot of experience. First of all, previously, before I broke out to do private guided safaris, I had the opportunity to not only guide, but manage camps, not only manage camps, but get involved in operations, marketing. So I learned the business, as it were. And then when I went out to doing private guided safaris, I mean, literally I was Beks Safaris and I was running a business. That became busy that I started to contract other guides to guide safaris that I couldn't lead. So at that point, I was really running a business, but without my own accommodation. But having been exposed to various parts of Africa, different safari camps, interacting with different managers, different camp owners, I felt that I was ready. And initially, it was really a dream to create a guides playground where guides all over Africa and other naturalists from around the world would come over there with their guests and really get to be who they are, which is teachers of the wild, people sharing their passion for the wild. And the camp was very, very rudimentary. I mean, it was myself and my ex-wife and a few friends that actually built it and a few staff from the local community. And, we did everything from design to interiors. I joke about it today, actually, and say that I'm a frustrated interior decorator and architect. But thankfully, I work with teams of people that are very capable and a lot better at it than I am. But it was fun doing it, and it's something that I still enjoy to this date. But that camp started off with just 6 tents, which was 12 beds. And literally, I had been a hoarder of furniture, artifacts, and all sorts of collectibles. And so that first camp was literally a migration of my home stuff from home into the bush. And that set up our first safari camp. But that was in 2006, just to put things in context. And some of you would know that in 2006, Zimbabwe wasn't exactly the flavor of the month. And very quickly, I realized that although I had so much passion for my home country, I needed to make some moves fairly quickly if I was to survive in my new cycle of being an entrepreneur and a businessman. So within that time of building Somalisa, this was a reality that was evolving. And within 6 months of opening Somalisa camp, I opened up my second camp in Botswana in the Linyanti area, and that was Linyanti Bush Camp. So from only wanting to have one safari camp, I now had 2 on my hands, and realizing the costs that go behind running safari camps. I wasn't just about to go overseas and spend all this marketing power and resources for people just to visit me. I realized I needed to create and craft a whole journey. And so from there, the whole idea and concept was to identify key areas that would become part of the journey of African bush camps that we feel passionate enough to share with our guests. And if we could, cover out a whole journey for people coming to Botswana and Zimbabwe. And of course, Zambia came in the later years, on the understanding that most of our guests want to see the Victoria Falls. But for our guests, we don't necessarily want them to be in the space of any highly developed area or city or town. So our choice of place was Mosi-oa-Tunya National Park in Zambia. And it only took me one trip. I'd always sworn that I would never go north of the Zambezi River, just as I've sworn never to go south of the Popo River. But I went across the Zambezi River into Zambia, went into Mosi-oa-Tunya, and I stood on the side of the Zambezi River, looking at these giant ebony trees and acacias, and listening to that rush of the Zambezi rivers, and in the distance with that smoke that thunders, the Victoria Falls. And I remember looking at my business partner, it was the 2 of us, and I say to him, I think we've got to do this. So there we adopted our 3rd country, being Zambia, and that's where we built Thorntree River Lodge.
Amazing. So, okay, let me ask a few questions here. Which is your favorite camp? Not that you have so many, do you have a favorite? I think all of them are amazing, but I'd like to know which one. Or do you think the one that really, where your heart and soul, maybe is it the first one you started? Yeah, I'd just like to know which one you still kind of hold dearly.
Yeah, so again, I get asked this question a lot of times, and I wish I could respond to you, Elizabeth, and say, you have more than one child. Which of your children is your favorite? And you wouldn't be able to say whether it was Sebastian or whoever it is. You would, I think, you would struggle to have a favorite. And it's the same with each camp. And I tell you, each camp I go to and spend a considerable amount of time, by the time I leave, I'm like, this is really special. And I find myself saying that to each of our camps. So Melissa definitely has a soft spot, and particularly I think it is a soft spot because my children identify with it because they've grown up going to that camp. And my oldest child, my son, is 12 years old. So we've got a lot of history around that. They haven't seen Nyamatusi yet, which is one of our newest camps in Zimbabwe. And I think that's really always had a special, the area itself, not so much the camp. I mean, the camp is really specially designed. We had lots of fun designing it. And of course, deciding how to deck it out and trying to make sure that it fitted in with the landscape, with the culture. It was a lot of fun. But I'd have to say that a place that, was 40 minutes from my doorstep when I lived in Bulawayo was a weekend getaway to my family where I saw my children the happiest going out to nature. And I would be out there every Friday, and that was our weekend getaway. And that was Matobo National Park. We have a house there that we call Kailicha House, and it can now be booked out as an exclusive villa with 4 bedrooms. And it's not so intense with wildlife, but it's really intense with nature, with history, and the landscape is arguably one of the most beautiful landscapes I've ever seen. That's got to be probably my number one at this stage. And maybe that's a little bit of nostalgia because I'm stuck in Cape Town with the lockdown and I missed this getaway to the countryside within a short distance. I don't know, but today that would be my response to that question.
Well, anyone who wants to know that, I encourage everyone to go travel and kind of find out for themselves and pick their own favorites as well. I do think Somalisa is a very special place. Maybe that's why I'm biased. So I do want to talk, I'd like to talk about African Bush Camp Foundation, and also right now how you've been dealing with having all your camps shut down. So much of what you do is working with communities. So how are you able to maintain that, and what has been the impact?
So first of all, when we started reacting to the situation of COVID-19, it was really important for us to recognize where we had spent 16 years worth of investment, and that investment that we need to protect. There was definitely our staff that we've been upskilling through the various training programs, and we really didn't want to lose any one of our staff, and that is still the sentiment today. It's the communities that we've invested so much time and energy and built up a trust and a very strong working relationship where we feel that we are truly in this together to ensure that they survive and they get through it, and that together we're able to look after our environs so that our environs are there in the future to look after all of us. And of course, the investment of having to look after the wildlife itself. We, as a matter of principle, gave the staff various options of retrenchment, putting people on forced leave, all through the legal processes, or saying, look, every single one of us that is in our business today is there for a reason. This was well thought through. And we need every single person on board if our business is going to thrive and be successful in the future. And so therefore, we've designed this so that if the business does well, everybody does well. So not only our staff, but also our communities and consequently our wildlife. And we are going into a period of time where this is a serious storm that we're going to have to hunker down and curl up and wait until the storm subsides enough so that we can get out and operate again. And during this period of time, it's going to be tough. It's going to be lean times. There's not going to be much work. So most of our staff only applying themselves on a rotational basis in the camps at 25% capacity. And with that, we have all across the group taken reduced earnings, including myself, right across the group to ensure that the business can actually survive financially for this period of time. And so everybody is feeling the pain, and everybody is on lean times, but we're in this together, and we're hoping that as soon as we can open, our lives can somewhat start to resume slowly back to what it was, if not better. And I avoid saying back to normal, because we all know that there's not going to be such a thing. And we're all going to have to figure out how our industry starts to unravel and what it's actually going to look like going forward in the future. And none of us have a crystal ball to tell what that looks like. I think we all understand today that what we understood about COVID-19 3 months ago is very different to what we know about it today. And hopefully how it evolves and what we'll know about it in 3 months' time is somewhat going to be very different to today. And hopefully for the positive, so that our tourism industry can start to function again in whatever shape it takes.
So it's interesting, as you mentioned, you know, coronavirus has made us really think about kind of like what tourism is going to look like in the future. But as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of the call, with Black Lives Matter, and, you know, as I said, I'm in the middle of DC, there's a lot of protests. It's making me think a lot about diversity. And, you know, as I prepared for our conversation, I'm thinking, wait, Beks is one of the few Black entrepreneurs, owners that I meet when I go to these trade shows. Very few people of color. It's not very diverse right now. And I think it's a good time to probably open up that dialogue. And I think just to think about it, you know, I'd like to kind of get this is a really an open dialogue. I want to talk about it with you, you know, your point of view on this. You're a real leader in the safari industry. And so I'd like to know, first of all, how has being kind of a Black leader in conservation impacted your conservation and community involvement?
So Elizabeth, I assume that you're asking that question pre-COVID-19 overall. So on that assumption, what I would say is that, you know, I believe that I've been advantaged in many ways because I come from these rural settings. And part of my objective has been always to get community trust. There's a lot of NGOs out there, you know, some of them relatively large, throwing around big budgets. But if you look at a lot of these NGOs that have come in, thrown a lot of money around, all that they've done is caused a lot of dependence. Well, it's caused communities to be very dependent on them, on these handouts. And the issue with that is that a lot of those projects or NGOs, they come and go depending on their levels of budget and future projections. We've always said that we're there to stay and we're investing for the long term with these communities, to the extent that when we go into areas, we do our due diligence in the area and we do assessments that tell us what the people's needs are. We get a very good understanding of the culture. And by the way, what must be put into context is that, you know, we very much believe in employing locally. We don't believe that we're doing these communities, as you and I have spoken about, we don't believe we're doing them a favor by employing them, but we're doing the right thing by employing locally. Because if we are to understand what the local dynamics are, what the local cultures are, we need to employ locally. And once we employ locally, we can start the generosity from our own people internally within our staff, and then go out to these catchment areas once we learn and understand the cultures and the people that we're dealing with and the problems and the issues that we're dealing with. And we've always very much believed that we cannot tackle the issues of conservation until we understand the dynamics of the people and until we get and combine those efforts, local people adjacent to those areas where we operate, and tackle this thing together. And unfortunately, the lack of trust often in these areas is actually has been influenced by certain NGOs that have come and gone and disappeared and left communities actually worse off than they found them. So we've always been very conscious that we don't dictate to the communities what they do or what they need. We get that cue from them, and we really see ourselves as a facilitator through tourism to be able to achieve those objectives. And so so yes, as a Black camp owner, what it's helped me is understand the cultural aspect of it. Obviously, speaking the language in places like Zimbabwe, not so much in Botswana. That's helped me quite a lot in being able to dialogue with local communities and gain their trust. So that's a big advantage, I guess, that I've had. But you know that this industry has traditionally been a white industry, and it still is. And hence your question about being one of a few Black camp owners. I do think that there are some phenomenal camp operators, tour operators, especially out of East Africa, in Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda. But I think, like anything else, when there's a crisis such as we're seeing in COVID-19, and I think this is again the outlook that we're getting from the US, for example, it's in strange times such as these, or when there's a crisis, that the underlying issues and concerns of these societies, of our society, these communities, that's when they actually bubble up and come to the surface. So I'm glad that we are having this conversation, because it is getting us to relook and saying, how do we shape our industry for the future? What do we need to do as an industry to diversify? We know that diversification is something that we constantly need to think about and have in our forefront. I mean, we obviously, through our camps and our Cape Town office, by the way, which has over 40 people, we are very conscious in the decisions that we make. It's not easy, and we don't have all the answers, and we don't have all the solutions either. But we are conscious in employing people, interviewing people as we create positions, as those come about when needed in our office, to really think it through, to say that, it would be great if we can get other people of color, because it is that diversity that we need that forms our perspectives as individuals, as organizations, that help us make future decisions. If you only are surrounded by people of a certain type and you don't have that diversity, you're going to have an influence that's very limited and not as diverse. And again, I think we try to be conscious, and that's something that we as an industry probably need to talk about quite a lot, and say that the future of conservation, the future of survival of our industry should be to take a lot of people from our local communities and bring them up into senior management positions, positions of influence, so that we can make those differences that we need for our industry. And ironically, one of the things that I think is going to give us a certain degree of success in conservation and addressing some of the issues surrounding our areas is the close-knit relationship that we have with our staff and with our communities. When we talk about communities, we're talking about right up to the eldership of these communities that are very influential with the rest of the people. And it's about the benefits and the tangible things that they've benefited from, that they know that they do not want to lose in the long term.
Yeah, I just think I think it's also very interesting, because even in our travelers, how do we diversify the people who are going on safaris too? And I think that's really interesting. Like, if you look at who goes on safari, we need to also make it appealing for more people of all kinds of backgrounds to come on safari as well. So I don't know, I look at it and I'm like, oh, it's interesting. Our imagery is a certain way. Have we changed the industry to make it, more appealing to more people? And I feel that's going to be also something interesting to think about in the future.
So it's a minefield. I mean, for you guys in the marketplace, it is a minefield, because I'm not so sure that the Black people of Africa, of the US, are necessarily focused on travel to Africa. And yet I do think it's a huge opportunity to connect people with their heritage. And in fact, I've had these conversations with a lot of my colleagues from the US, such as Naledi, who heads up ATA, with Waja, who heads up our marketing in the US. How can we appeal to the African-American, to the Black audience of the US, and try to link them up with a cultural aspect of Africa, and at the same time, an awareness of the need to conserve our wilderness areas, which really, we've made huge, big strides in Africa with tackling climate change through saving what I believe are the organs of the world. And those, that awareness needs to really go out there to people all over, and that diversity that you're talking about, how do people in like yourselves, your tour operations in the US, appeal to those societies, appeal to those audiences, because it's through that the awareness goes across the entire spectrum of the audience of the general populace. So it is a challenge, and as I said to you, I don't have any answers, but it's certainly the conversations we should be having from a trade perspective in your area, and it's certainly the conversations we should be having in our part of the world to really increase the voices in this area.
Yeah, I just think it's the voices and bringing in, I've talked to quite a few people these last few days, and I think the conversation is also interesting is, how do you get people in the industry? As you said, you're working with the local communities where you are and getting them up, through the ranks, through different organizations. On our side, it's also, I think it's such an insular little world, and we just kind of hire everyone who we know. And we need to appeal for more people to feel that they're welcome in the travel industry as well. I think.
How easy is that for you? Do you want to maybe talk a little bit? Because I don't have time. So I'll tell you so quite often in our part of the world, trying to get Black people to come and join us as somebody in reservations or in management or something like that in our office, it's quite a task, because a lot of Black people in our part of the world traditionally and inherently have always known that, if you have a real job, you go to work in a jacket and tie, very smart. You don't, I come to the office in shorts and t-shirts and sometimes sandals. You kind of aren't really taken serious by society. But it's a lack of knowledge of a profession, of a whole industry that's out there that's centered around lifestyles. And so as a result of that, we found it incredibly difficult to find Black people to really sort of ramp up our numbers. So, I mean, our numbers aren't, I wouldn't say they're great, but we certainly have made a lot of progress in that area in getting more people of color into office space. But how about you guys in the US? I mean, I assume that you don't have any people of color working for Extraordinary Journeys at the moment. I mean, how easy is it to appeal to that audience? Because it's through that they can go back to their families, to their communities, and tell them about this other world that exists.
I think that's a good question. It's something that's always kind of in the back of my mind. I think one of the problems, I think a lot of the people we hire in the industry is word of mouth. It's people we know. So I do think, and it's something I thought about a lot, we need to stretch ourselves, go out, and we're a bigger company now where I don't always need to hire someone who already knows the industry. And I think we're going to be working much harder to start people from the bottom up. And once people have been exposed, once people have been trained, they can go to other companies. But I think the safari industry is so specific that people tend to hire people who've already worked in it. And so you're kind of everyone just kind of stays within the family, and it's really hard to bring in
the rotation of the same people in our industry, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And then because a lot of companies are small, they tend, and maybe the bigger companies are different, but a lot of safari companies, they're projects of passion. So people just kind of hire a friend of a friend. No one has big HR or have done anything to kind of go out of their comfort zone. So I think it does demand a little bit of going out, trying a little harder and exposing a new generation. And I think the problem is also, I don't really know where to go out and find new people sometimes. It's even hard just in general in the industry. I think you hire, you do it the same, I'm sure, at Bush Camp. You're talking about, you're probably hiring people who worked in the safari business before. You always want the best people. So I think it just demands a little bit of work on my side and I don't know how much people don't even know about the industry sometimes. They don't even know they can apply to it and be part of it. So I think it's really, what's interesting to me though is how you got exposed, right? But there is exposure to a certain area, because look at you had your journey. Somehow, at what point did you meet people along the way that told you, hey, this could be a career you could go into?
So as I mentioned earlier on, that really happened in the last 2 years of my high school years. I was one of those guys that by the time I left school, I had enough of learning in between four walls, and I really wanted a different kind of education, and I never seemed to find in traditional forms what that might look like. And so the obvious one for me by the time I left was the fact that, hold on, the last 2 years, I've really loved being outdoors. I've loved visiting safari camps. doing all the menial tasks as a volunteer. And actually, this could be a career. And I started organically at the very lowest of positions and worked my way to the top and focused on that. But thankfully, I got a little introduction to tourism and to the idea that this could be pursued as a career during that period of time. Had I not been exposed to it, I don't know. I could be an accountant. I could be not that being an accountant is
that sounds really, that's exactly where I see you, Beks, in accounting. Absolutely.
We do need accountants. We do need accountants. We need lawyers. We need all these different professions. It just was not for me. And so I was very thankful to find that early enough and have a conviction of, this is where my belonging is. And as I work through that industry, to be able to be exposed to the dire need of our continent, of our communities, and start to build a passion to really want to weigh in and help out where we can. And that's why when we started African Bush Camps, concurrently we started our foundation, because we felt that it was important as a business to build up a business that would actually consisted of both experiential travel, but also conservation and working with communities. I don't think that those could be separated in our environment today.
So my other question I have though is, okay, so you were exposed, there are a lot of other people like you, I mean, I go to camps, there are some great guides and everything. Why though, are there so few people of color in leadership though? How are we getting from being just a guide or to being more like on the executive side or having more of a leadership voice? Does that make sense? It's still not there yet. And do you see a change happening, or is this something that you think is getting better maybe?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's, I don't know if you've heard of African Leadership University. I think that there is a change that's happening that started off a few years ago. And hopefully this is something that will be a wave of capturing new generations of Africans that are bold enough to step forward and say, I put up my hand to lead. There's certainly a lot of very successful camp owners and tour operators, as I've mentioned, in places like East Africa, some in Southern Africa. But I don't believe we fully have come out with wanting to take part in the front line. And through this African Leadership University, I think they're really making a concerted effort to talk about the business of conservation, the business of tourism, and how people can actually step out of their comfort zone to take their part into leading. It's really not an easy business, first of all, to enter into the tourism space. And to take a lead takes a lot of sacrifice, which we should all be prepared to do. But as I say, it's something that you're quite right, the industry needs. And what the solution is, I don't know. I think it also takes a lot of the event organizers. It takes all of us as an industry to maybe even have some kind of slush fund to start to groom young leaders, or when I say young, I'm talking about new in the tourism space, and be all inclusive in their involvement, whether it be conservation discussions or talks such as these, to encourage people and make people believe that they are partly involved in what we're doing as an industry. I think it's very important to make that concerted effort, because it's not just going to happen on its own. And whether we like it or not, it is viewed as a white-dominated industry, and that's got to change at some point. Particularly because I believe I have seen the success that it's brought to African bush camps in certain key areas when it's come to dialoguing with communities. And I really think that if we can have a wave of leadership of Black people from the levels of camp managers, which we are promoting quite heavily, because they're the first people in the line of sight with our teams on the ground, we can really create these ambassadors for conservation within these communities, so that we can encourage others to come along the journey. And it's those people that we should be looking at in future to become the custodians and the guardians of what we're doing as a whole.
And that's interesting what you're talking about, the custodian and guardians, how much they're part, as you said, conservation demands everyone has to be on board. And I think it is dangerous if it's just seen like as a white thing, you know, it's just like whites are the only ones concerned. I think it should be everyone's concern, the conservation. So I think that was kind of an interesting point you make there.
Yeah, so what I need to also point out, Elizabeth, you know, when we talk about conservation, there's obviously others who have the opportunity, like myself, to be on these chat forums, and I'm very much feel privileged and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be vociferous in this regard. There are people in the communities out there who are conservationists naturally and continue to practice sustainable living and lifestyles far more than people in many other aspects of it. They just don't have the platforms necessarily to be able to voice what it is that they're doing. So that needs to be acknowledged too. But certainly I think one of the things that needs to change as a narrative is we need to identify more and more of those kind of people to come out on the forefront and actually tell their story.
Yeah.
I think it's important that people start to hear the success stories of Black Africans in those areas that are doing the right thing. Because if it were not for them, we would, you know, a lot of us would not be able to have the platform in order to tell the success stories that are there.
I think you're absolutely correct. And I think it's just, we're not telling it enough, you know, it's just getting that voice. That's what I mean by that voice has to come out. I think it's making more of an effort there. But I think a lot of people have a lot of questions. So I just kind of wanted to open it up a little bit to a Q&A. So one question was from Trista, which I believe you know Trista from Kern Downey. Some of our friendly competitors on the call, and I think it's great. And she wanted to know if there were obstacle barriers to get investment funding for opening camps, and wondering if economics is often the base of many equity issues.
That's a very good question. You know, our industry, because it's such a fickle industry, very much determined by the temperature of climate world events, banks in general, this part of the world, they don't like to fund us. And also, I mean, if you look at a safari camp, it's fabric, it's wood, all the stuff deteriorates within a period of 10 years. So it's quite a volatile, difficult industry. My success model, not having come from a background of a wealthy family, I took out my begging bowl when I started my first safari camps with the little that I had and said, this is how much I have, this is how much I need. I approached previous clients, other family members, and my begging bowl soon filled up and I was able to have my first safari camp. And because I did a decent job at that, I was able to do the same for my second safari camp. So I've always been able to build and maximize other people that are passionate about Africa, passionate about conservation, about wildlife, and are big supporters of mine. And I think the private equity space is probably where any Black entrepreneur is going to get their capital from if you don't come from, you know, a wealthy background. So that is definitely a barrier to entry. And it's something that I've worked organically over the years. And I take a very keen interest in people that want to support the causes that I rally behind. And that's been a success of mine, to attract the right investment. Although, you know, historically, that's been also one of the downfalls, the need for resources versus trying to tie up the right people. And that could also end up leading you into all sorts of trouble in terms of investment. So I think that's an important aspect of it, is to try to find people that are very passionate about Africa, share the same values in terms of conservation in communities, and are there for the long haul, because this industry, as I say, is very fickle and very subject to the temperament of what's happening globally.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm a little silent as I'm trying to read, and I don't know if everyone can read some of the comments, there's just been some really interesting comments. One of them is about, you know, exposure, just again, like how do we expose more people? I think through marketing and social media. And that's what we talked about, like diversifying voices, getting more, you know, even in the imagery, let's be honest, like we got to change, I think, some of what's out there. You know, I think some of the imagery is a little old school. I don't know. That's how I feel sometimes. It's not, you know, we got to get more voices on the ground to talk, as you said, and changing just making sure also young people feel that there are opportunities in the space. Someone was asking, like, do we know if millennials even know that there's a place in the tourism industry right now? Like, are people getting into tourism at all?
So those are very good questions, because I think quite often we look at our industry and we say to ourselves, what is our typical clientele who will visit our camps? Okay, it's the 45 to 75, let's say, for example. And we tend to market in that space for those people and raise awareness in that space. I think it is important to diversify that and start targeting people in the other brackets, all the millennials, and the new generation, whether it's Project Z or whatever you want to call it. So interestingly, one of the things that we've started doing recently is and you'll see it more and more, it's going to be visible. We've taken on an actress out of the UK who visited us and spent a lot of time in our camp supporting us. Her name is Ellie Bamba. And she's 23 years old. I mean, she's still a child, but she's highly influential. I think has a following of something like 200,000 people. And it's those people that need to have it in their minds today that there's a whole new world outside of the urban circles of where they live. And this new world needs their attention, because in the future, if we don't start looking back and saying, how can we impact this younger generation so that they're aware of the urgency to actually tackle some of these concerns, we are going to be always on a back foot and behind. So it is a good question. We do need to start looking at those different age groups and saying, what can we do to get them interested? That's one of the reasons why, as a business, we've always been very keen to develop family travel. In all our locations, we've really tried to make sure that we're representative and can have family impacts, high family impact camps. And in our part of the world, that's why we work quite a lot with education with a young audience. There's over 30 people that develop from various scholarship programs in Zimbabwe. There's over 1,000 kids that benefit directly and indirectly from the schools that we support. I mean, education is probably the biggest project that we take on and embark on through our foundation, because we want to change people's perceptions. We want to change people's minds from a very young, early age. None of us today can complain about poor current world leadership all over the world, by the way, if we're not doing anything to impact future leadership.
Okay, this is, so there are a lot of comments and people can read them. Actually, there are quite a few comments telling me that millennials are actually growing in industry. It was pointed out, Waja, who's the head of YTP, which is Young Travel Professionals, he says they have over 12,000 members who are under the age of 30. They've had over 35,000 members under the age of 35 over 7 years. So there are quite a few young people coming in. One comment that I find interesting from Temba, where he says, from what I have observed over the years and discussions with colleagues and friends in the industry, or those who studied travel and tourism, Black people do get in, but the lack of transformation hinders their growth, and some leave the sector due to frustrations. Sorry, kind of like noon is a little bit kind of tripping on my words right now.
So that is that's a statement. So I'm not quite sure what to add to it, but I would probably support that statement in that, you know, if Black people within the sectors that Temba Ndai is talking about, if people are not getting equal opportunities, if they're not getting promoted, if they're not being heard, if they're not being seen, they will give up hope of being able to move up in the ladder, and they'll get off the bus and find a different profession where they hope to succeed. So again, it comes down to what we were talking about earlier on, being able, we all have to employ, being conscious of who we're employing. We all have to be conscious of giving people equal opportunities. You have a lot of problems at the moment. Well, the whole world actually has a lot of problems with the systemic racism. And this is what organizations such as Black Lives Matter try to really emphasize in these places, that, you know, where you live in your part of the world, particularly where I would say there's a racism pandemic. And it's because people aren't given an equal opportunity to get involved and go up. And I think that statement that Themba actually made is not true only for the tourism industry. It probably might be worse for the tourism industry because it's not seen as a black game. But that is probably true across the board for many other industries. And it's something that I think we can't sweep under the carpet or continue to ignore because it affects everyone. It affects the entire world. So it's something that hopefully during this period of time is giving people a sense of awareness to be conscious and to act accordingly.
It's interesting because it's actually a lot of the comments are mentioning, and I'm guessing some of the people who are on this call, they're saying this is so true in a lot of industries. This is not a safari industry problem. This is not just a travel industry problem. This applies to a lot of places. So I think I think it's really important that we're all talking about it and thinking about it right now, and make changes for the future. So that's, again, as you said, I think there were a lot of great points brought up today. Do you feel, as we talked, is there anything that you want to talk about that you think we should, I know you said you're not sure how everything changes, but that you could already see first steps that we should be doing right away? And even talking to me that you see with my company, I'm like, what should I be doing?
So again, as we talked earlier on, Elizabeth, I think the first step is acknowledgement that this is an issue. And then being brave enough to talk about it. I mean, it's a pretty sensitive issue that quite often could be contentious, and so people avoid the subject. But I think it's great to bring it to the surface and have people actually talk and have people listen. But it really should not end there. And I'm hopeful that as human beings, we're not looking at this with a very short-term memory, and that it merely ends as a discussion, because we've seen it come up time and time again. As I said, whenever there's a crisis, this comes to the surface. This is not the first time this kind of thing has come up to the surface. There's years in history you can see it where it's bubbled, and it's going to keep coming. Some people have actually referred to it as a debt. If we don't pay that debt today, it just accumulates, and it's going to come due at some point when it comes to the surface. So it's not something that we need to run away from. And if we run away from it today, it's going to affect your children, their children, and it starts with us acting on it today. And it's not just issues, I suppose, I hope will bring about some change as a result of COVID, but also a sense of awareness that this is something that I need to be aware of when I employ, when I interview, when I choose CVs or shortlist. What does that actually look like? And then give people a fair chance. And one of the things I've been talking about from an environmental perspective, we've seen how the environment has recovered and bounced back in such a short space of time as a result of a lack of movement, traffic, etc. And the world, the planet will be here many years after we've perished if we're not careful. So I think we need to also start to make lifestyle choices and changes that are good for the environment. And it starts with that first step. You don't have to make changes in leaps and bounds. It's that first step that you make that makes a very big difference. From as an office, as a business, where do you procure the coffee that you drink in your office? Do you have a recycle bin and do you actually use it? Who do you deal with? Where do you get your stuff printed? Do you use paper that's sustainable? All these little choices are things that part of our brain has been completely either numbed or just unconscious. And we need to start being very conscious on every level, to the extent that choose people in your organization that are the drivers of these thoughts, and they can actually hold each other accountable. And in fact, the fact that we're talking about it right now means that we're putting up our hands and saying, this is what we believe in, and please, world, hold us accountable in the future. Because if I don't change, or if I'm seen to be doing something completely different to what I spoke about, then I'm just paying lip service, and I don't deserve to be on the front of being supported in my business. So again, we like to believe that people like yourselves do business with us because you know that your clients' monies, hard-earned monies, will end up in the right places, doing the right thing for the planet.
No, absolutely. And I'm just really glad we had this conversation, Bex. Like, as I mentioned, I think when I first talked to you on WhatsApp, I was like, we never talk about this. And I just think it's important that we still start just talking about it. So I'm really glad we were able, that we did it. As you said, it's always something you're really nervous about. And I hate that we never just feel comfortable just saying, hey, how do we change it? How do we go forward? I don't know why we've never even like talked about it before. So I think it's been really great for me, and I think there's a lot for me to think forward. Unfortunately, we're not hiring right now. um,
We should all be hiring right now. We all need jobs, right?
exactly. But I do think when things get back and people are traveling again, I just look forward to, as you said, it's each little step, each going forward to the next level. And I think there's a lot of positive that can come out as well.
Look, we're very thankful to Extraordinary Journeys, to you and your team, for setting up these talks and setting up with a sense of awareness for people to donate to a cause of their choice. It's really, again, thinking outside the box and being conscious of the needs, the desperate needs that are actually there right now, especially during this time of very little travel and very little tourism. And those donations really go a long way, because out of anything else that we do, we believe now more than ever, we have to be heavily invested in the communities. We have to be heavily invested in security of the wildlife, because it will perish if we don't focus on those areas. Those are not the areas where we can relax. Those are not the areas we can take a sabbatical on. So to you and your organization, thank you very much for all these efforts that you've really made. And it's that consciousness that we hope will continue to be at the forefront of each of our organizations, and we can make the right decisions going forward. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And anyone who is, just putting it out there, anyone who is interested in traveling, things are getting booked up for 2021 and 2022. And I know people aren't thinking about it yet, but if you are looking to go and go to Beks camps, they are amazing. Definitely, don't hesitate to start looking into it. The space is getting a little tight, which sounds kind of weird for everyone. You're like, how is it that 2021 is already booked up? But think of everyone who's moved their trips from this year to next year. So if you are thinking of going to Africa, I would encourage you to think about it now. Start booking.
Well, booking is certainly the best way to support our initiatives on the ground, to support not just our businesses, but certainly to support the communities and conservation.
Exactly. I will email, so I think everyone's asking a lot of questions about, your camps and everything. I'll send an email after all of this with all the information about African bush camps, the foundation, all the camps, all the places where they operate, and I'll have that all in writing. So Beks, thank you for joining us. I see you said you were at the office. Are you still working at this hour? It's already 7 o'clock.
Yeah, people like you have me working long hours. So you get on and do it, right?
There you go. Okay, thank you, Beks. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to everyone.
Okay, sounds good. Bye.